wasn't so long after that Tommy came along, which was an Australian version of the hit musical, and it was held at the My Music Bowl.
Yeah.
And you were involved in that as the father, who was a sea captain.
Yeah, I was Darryl Braithwaite's. He was my son. Colin Hewitt and I were married, and I'd been away for a long time, and we had this deaf, dumb and blind son, which was Darryl. And we did 3 shows with that, and Dingoes were being formed at that time, but I'd been offered the part in Tommy after a few people crazily had knocked it back. And I said, yeah, and the band said, yeah, let's do it, because...
It was an amazing cast, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, he'd give us some sort of name and focus before we even start the band. So I did that, and then after that, we we went out on the road with Dingoes.
And Keith Moon was in the cast as well. That must have been an amazing experience working with him.
Yeah, he was quite amazing. There was another fellow called Graham Bell too, from a band called Bell and Ark, that was in it, had a real bad drug problem, and that was a worry whether he was going to make the gig. Whereas Moon had a brandy problem, and he was actually a lovely guy, and you could see he had a really warm heart, but he was really out to, he was like driving a fast car towards a big brick wall. That's sort of where he was at.
Did you ever see the faces of the children? They get so excited. Waking up on Christmas morning out before the winter sun's ignited. They believe in dreams and all they mean, including heaven's generosity. Peeping round the door to see what parcels offer free in curiosity. And Tommy doesn't know what day it is. He doesn't know what Jesus was or what prayer it is. How can he be saved from the eternal grave? Tommy, can you hear me? 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 Tommy, can you hear me?
Broderick, let's pick up the story with the breakup of Carson and after the musical Tommy, which we saw. As you said, you went on to form the great band, the Dingoes. Whose idea was that?
It was mainly Karen Tolhurst, and mine probably. He'd been talking about it for a while. He was in a band called Country Radio that had played a lot of old Australian bush songs, and were sort of a singer-songwriter band. And he'd always wanted to form a band with an Australian name, and so did I, and to sing about Australian things from our own experience mostly. And so I think I came up with the name of the band, the Dingoes, and I found a bit in an encyclopedia where it said they always travelled in a small group, and as soon as the children were old enough to fend for themselves, the male split. And I thought that sounded like rock band. So we took the name from that.
And you had some great success with the Dingoes, of course, with songs like Way Out West and Boy on the Run and Payday Again. Which is your favourite Dingoes song?
Probably one called Singing Your Song that Karen wrote, which was on the 5 Times the Sun album. That's probably my favourite. Karen was the main songwriter in that band, and if you're talking about songwriters that I've worked with, he's probably the best. And yeah, I mean, he wrote All Fired Up, which Pat Benatar recorded and was a big hit, and Man on Your Mind he wrote for with Glenn Shorrock for Little River Band, and he lives most of the time now in New York. So he's one of those quiet achievers, people that the public wouldn't really know about. But he was the main driving force, I'd say, for that band.
And were you a fan of country radio?
Yeah, I liked country radio. I liked what they were trying to do, and they were the fathers really of the scene we're talking about, that Australian thing. Once again, they're a band that people don't talk about much these days. They had Gypsy Queen and Winter Song, I think, were their two hits, both of which Karen either wrote or co-wrote.
What were you hoping to achieve with the Dingoes? What did you want to set out to do?
Well, we were talking about the Whitlam years when that band was around, and the Whitlam years was, from my experience of being in Australia, was a very pro-Australian period, when we were all of a sudden proud to be an Australian, right? And the Dingoes came out of that, and because we were about the first major Australian band to have an Australian name, we were also, people in politics were aware of us. Margaret Whitlam was aware that we were around, and when we went to America, which we'll get into, we needed to get a piece of paper to show that we were doing something that wouldn't put Americans out of jobs, to get a visa, and we got a lovely letter from the Minister for the Arts at the time, praising the band, and that's all we needed to get it.
Well, with a song like Way Out West, for example, which you wrote.
No, I didn't write that. Karen, there's a funny story behind that story. A song which should be made clear is Karen Tolhurst wrote that song, 90% of that song. But because when we did that first album, some of the members hadn't written any tunes, he gave it to the band as a gift, as a band co-write, not thinking in his wildest imagination that it would become a hit later on for other people. So he, for all intents and purposes, wrote that song. Boy on the Run, I can lay claim to 50% of that, but not that one really.
And what did you think, by the way, of the James Rain, James Blundell version of it, which went to #1 just a few years back?
Yeah, number 2.
Number 2, right?
Number 2. Well, I was grateful for the check. I was never a big fan of that particular song. It just was a song that we got stuck with, you know, like Daddy Cool have to do Eagle Rock every time they reform, they've got to do that song. I didn't mind the song, but and I thought they did a creditable version of it anyway.
As you say, the Dingoes were one of the first Australian bands to penetrate the American market. How was your introduction to America made?
We were in Perth, and we were actually discussing breaking the band up. And we got a phone call. The receptionist was very excited, saying there's a Mr. McCartney on the phone from New York. I think it was Paul McCartney. But it was actually Billy McCartney, an Australian roadie, that had ended up working in America. He'd worked for Elvis, doing his story is quite amazing in itself. I mean, there's some amazing stories about Australian people that you never hear of. The Clare Brothers, which are a huge PA company around the world, is an Australian company. And he was working for Clare Brothers, and he ended up working for this mad Englishman called Peter Rudge that had worked with the Stones, was the Stones world tour manager. And he had played schoolboy rugby at Cambridge against Australians and really dug Australians. And Billy kept talking to him about this band, and actually the Dingoes album used to get played before Elvis at Las Vegas. Before he went on, they'd put it on. So never met him, but he's heard my songs. And he got us the deal, and we ended up going to America for 2 years.
And you supported the cult band Lynyrd Skynyrd?
Yeah, well, Peter managed Lynyrd Skynyrd, and they were the father band in the management. They were the ones earning all the money. And we were these sort of second-rung bands. We were on the same rung with a band called 38 Special, which was Ronnie Van Zant, the singer from Lynyrd Skynyrd. His brother Donnie was the singer in 38 Special. There's Ronnie, Donnie and Johnny, actually, 3 brothers, believe it or not.
Creative parents.
Yeah, and they were Southern boys from Gainesville in Florida. And we actually never supported them. We were about to go and do a support for them on a tour when their plane crashed.
Mm.
But we'd hung out with them a few times, and they're pretty wild characters. I mean, Australian bands would drink beer. I mean, these guys drank Jack Daniels like we drink beer. Unbelievable. I got out of it one night with them, and much to my regret.
And 3 of their members died in that plane crash.
Yes, Ronnie died, and Steve Gaines, and actually they were the only 2 members of the actual band, and Cassie, Steve's sister, who was one of the singers, she died as well, and some of the crew. There was about 6 people died. It was quite a tragic accident.
So you never actually got to support them?
No, no. We were about to start a tour. We were 3 weeks away to jumping on the tour, and their plane crashed.
What was the highlight of working over in the States for you?
Gig-wise, probably the bottom line in New York. We played with Tom Petty there 2 nights, and the first night we cut the hell out of him. And then we all got out of it and celebrated that night, and he cut the hell out of us the second night. But that was a very good gig, and for one brief moment in time we owned a part of New York.
How long
Which is very hard to do, actually, when you think
imagine.
about the size of that bloody place.
How long did the band spend in the US?
The band was there for 2 years, and then when the plane crashed, the heart went out of Pete Rudge because he was a fellow that was very close to his acts, and he took a back pedal from the industry, and 38 Special went on to different management, and we just basically split up, and I came back here, and Karen and John, the 2 Johns, John Boyce and John Lee, they stayed on, and Karen ended up working with Jimmy Fast Fingers Dawkins, and doesn't mean anything to anybody, and Mick Ronson, and a lot of really interesting people, which he still does. And the bass player went to school, and he went to Harvard or Yale or somewhere, and he's now a high school teacher in Washington. And John Lee, he ended up working with Ronnie Spector and James Cotton and different people like that, and he's back here living in Fitzroy.
Well, you must get asked this
And Chris
constantly.
Stockley's back here too, he lives in Elwood, yeah.
Chris Stockley, yes.
Yeah.
You must get asked this all the time about a Dingoes reforming, like so many bands of the 70s have done it, and you must have been tempted at some stage to do that?
Yeah, sort of, but the band was not what you would call a huge public band. It was an industry band. It was a very, very big industry band, and there's a big difference. And I've noticed that all the bands that have reformed and come out and done tours, they've tarnished their past in a way. They've never really lived up to how people remember them. So I'm really not into that sort of thing that much. I wouldn't mind doing a little acoustic thing with Chris Stockley and Karen at some point, just the 3 of us. That sort of makes sense. I know that way promoters won't get their fingers burnt. I hate it when promoters lose money. You know, it's just an awful feeling, especially when you have to meet them after the gig. Not good.
The Dingoes produced just 3 albums. There was the self-titled one, 5 Times the Sun and Orphans of the Storm.
Mm-hmm.
You went through it before, but why did the band split up, apart from the Peter Rudge business?
Well, the band had kind of split up before anyway, because we felt we'd gone as far as we could. So when he actually signed us, he didn't know it, but he'd signed a band that had broken up. So we stuck together for the 2 years for the experience of going to America and working on that level too. The people that we were working with were and meeting were quite big people. We were very, very lucky. I mean, we played in little clubs in the States, and we'd be playing some Yank band. They say, you know, who manages you guys? We'd say, Sir Productions. They go, bull. And we go, yeah. You know, I managed like he'd have James Taylor for dinner and stuff. You know, it was that sort of thing. You know, it was like we missed out on the last waltz night by 3 weeks because we were invited to that. I mean, if we'd have got there, we would have gone backstage and met all of our heroes at once. So it was quite a lofty circle that we were associated with. And that was quite amazing.
Heady days indeed. Now, on the Green Door, a special treat recorded earlier, a version of the Dingoes' classic Boy on the Run from 1974. Accompanying Broderick is Matt Walker on the guitar.
He was running like a native across the creek, singing in the field, in the wind, in the sun. There he goes, racing down the street, just like a boy on the run. Well, he takes a stone and throws it in the water, watches the circles as they slowly fade, fills the air with sudden laughter as it reminds him of all the plans that watching his hourglass. Down the street the accordions are calling. Stay away, boy, there's nothing for you here. He can hear the buildings falling as they're stripping away all of his years. He was running like a native across the creek, singing in the field, in the wind, in the sun. There he goes, racing down the street, just like a boy